Have you ever wanted blazing fast speed for your Azure Virtual Desktop session hosts? What about cost reductions? If you want a solution which massively speeds up your session hosts and saves you money, today I've got the perfect video for you. Today, we're going to talk about ephemeral disks. Ephemeral disks are the local disks attached to the session hosts inside your Azure environment. And the benefit from using ephemeral disks is the fact that because it's local storage, you get low latency, much higher throughput, and lots of IOPS. If disk performance is one of the things you need for your session hosts, definitely look at ephemeral disks. Today, I'm going to show you what you need to create ephemeral disks. We'll log on to some VMs, do some performance differences, and then we'll discuss, okay, why would we not use ephemeral disks, right? So looking forward to today's video. If you are interested in ephemeral disks or faster performance for your VMs at zero cost, then carry on watching because you're going to find this really interesting. First, talk about what an ephemeral disk is. An ephemeral disk is a local disk attached to your VM, right? So within Azure, session hosts are basically just virtual machines running inside the Azure data center. Each of those VMs has a local disk attached to a physical host. That's what the ephemeral disk is. The downside to the ephemeral disk is the fact that it's non-persistent. A managed disk is like your premium or standard SSD. That's actually remote storage, and it's just attached to session hosts when the VM boots up. The downside to the ephemeral disk is that when I switch off the virtual machine and when the machine boots back up, it has to read from the VM image we're using to fire up that VM. So it's essentially a non-persistent workload. And the other downside is you can't actually turn them off and on. Normally with a sort of managed disk, you turn it off, your data's saved, you turn it on again, and your data's there. But with ephemeral disk, we can't really do that. What people normally do is they basically just recreate their VMs every day, right? I'll show you how to do that as well. The biggest benefit customers get from using ephemeral disk is the performance. Because it's a local disk, you get much higher IOPS. We're going to do some performance testing on some session hosts. I'm going to log on to a session host with a managed disk, run some disk IOPS software, and then do the same test on two separate VMs. So I'm going to run it on a smaller VM and a much bigger VM as well, just to see what kind of performance differences we get, because the bigger VM, the bigger ephemeral disk we get, and therefore hopefully the more IOPS we'll get. I just want to perform that test to see what that goes. All right, so let's actually go and have a look at how we do with ephemeral disks, what VMs support ephemeral disks, and then we'll go and show you how you can create a VM that uses ephemeral disk as well. All right, so let's go. Let's look at some of the requirements for ephemeral disks and some of the stuff it doesn't support. So I'm just going to head over to the documentation. So the first thing we need to think about is the size. Because the ephemeral disk is essentially a local disk on the VM, the local disk on the VM needs to be at least the minimum size of the image that we're using, right? So the default Azure Marketplace image, that's going to be around 127 gigs. So that's requirement number one. So requirement number one is it has a local disk, and that local disk must be at least equal to the size of the image that we're using, okay? Second requirement that we've got is around the VM sizes. So only certain VMs support ephemeral disk, so we're going to go into that shortly, but not all VM SKUs support it. It is supported within all regions, so there's no region that doesn't support ephemeral disks. And the key thing that you need to think about here, especially from a cost perspective, is this. The fact that we can't stop and deallocate an ephemeral VM with an ephemeral disk, right? We can't. So I'll show you. If I go to the Nerdio portal, you can see here I've got this VM, which has got a ephemeral disk on it. I can't stop it, right? The power off is grayed out, okay? The only way we could get rid of that VM is to delete it. That's why I would say ephemeral disk is for non-persistent workloads, because we either keep the VM powered on 24/7 using like reservations or something, or every day, instead of stopping the VM, we delete it and create a new one. That's the non-persistent workload, and that's why it's called non-persistent, because we can't persist it. We can't stop and restart it, okay? All right, now, I guess the other downside that you get to it is there's certain features that it doesn't support, okay? It doesn't support disk snapshots, which is not a problem for multi-session hosts. It doesn't support disk encryption, so if it's a security requirement that you need to encrypt your disks, ephemeral disk is not going to be for you. Azure backups, it doesn't support Azure Site Recovery, so if you're using the single session desktops and using Azure Site Recovery, this is not for you. And also, it doesn't support OS disk swaps as well, right? So for me, the biggest downside is the fact that you can't stop and restart it, and you have to recreate your VM every day. If your image management is on point and you're always updating your master image, that'll work perfectly fine for you. But if you deploy applications to your session host rather than your image, this isn't going to work. Every every time we restart the VM, we have to use the master image as the source of truth for those session hosts. And we can use just in launch as well for ephemeral disks if you want to. And you can also use confidential VMs as well if you need to, but so you can't do the disk encryption. Okay, so how do we figure out how we can actually use ephemeral disks if our VM SKU support it? When you go to the Azure portal, the key thing to look out for is when you go to the VM SKUs page, wherever it says ephemeral disk OS supported. So you can see here, I'm looking at the DDS V5 series of VMs. If we look at these VMs, you can see here local storage. So that's the key thing. If it doesn't have local storage, we can't use ephemeral disks. And it gives you some stats around performance as well. But yeah, the key thing is just make sure it says ephemeral OS disk supported. And then we can look at the different SKU types. For example, we can look at the DADS V5. And then we can look at the local storage. What you'll generally find is, as I mentioned, the size of the temp disk needs to be at least the size of your image, right? Here, for example, we can see the D2DS V5. If I try to create a VM with ephemeral disk using an image which is 127 gig, I can't, right? So my minimum VM size would be this D4DS V5, unless I shrunk my master image down to 64 gig, which is possible. Okay, and you can see here the amount of kind of IOPS and throughput that you get. So the bigger the VM, the more IOPS and throughput that you're going to get from that local disk as well. Okay, but that only becomes useful if you actually need that, right? So if you give the average user this amount of IOPS and throughput, they probably won't notice unless you've got some specific applications which need that amount of performance data. Okay, so that's the general guidelines. I say, to me, the biggest thing are you can't stop and start it. So you delete and recreate. And your image needs to be at least the size of the temp disk. Okay. There are the differences, though. Obviously, the alternative is you use like managed disk, but we'll look at the performance differences between those two VMs as well. All right. So that's all the theory. So now what I'm actually going to do is I've actually go ahead and I've created some VMs. So I'm going to do three comparisons here. So I've created one VM, which has got a D4 ADS V5. I've created another, which is a D64 ADS V5, because I want to see the performance differences. So stick around the way for that one. And then we're also just going to run the performance test against a managed disk, just 128 gig premium SSD as well. All right, so let's go and actually log on to one of the VMs, run Crystal disk benchmarking. We're going to look at the throughput, we're going to look at the IOPS, and then we're going to compare between those three and see what the differences are. And then I'm also going to show you how you create ephemeral disks, right? How do you select them? Okay, so we'll do that next. Now we're going to show you how to create ephemeral disk, how to select it. So I'm using Nidio to do that. Okay, I'm going to head over to the Nidio portal. If I was creating a new host pool, for example, so I'm going to go to add dynamic host pool, and then we're just going to type in that test. I'm going to select Entra ID as my directory and not use f-exotics. Now, this is where we select it. So we can see the VM size of the OS disk. If I go down a bit, you can see here I've got a tick box for ephemeral OS disk, so I'm just going to select that. So this is grayed out, right? And that's because this VM SKU probably doesn't support it. If I then go and select D4 AS V5, for example, I still can't select any VMs, right? But if I then go and select another SKU, D4 ADS underscore V5, for example, you can see here that I'm now able to select that SKU. And that's basically telling me the temp disk is 150 gig. Okay, so it's going to use 128 gigs of that because that's the managed image for that OS. It's going to leave a bit spare on there as well. If you go up to the bigger VMs, so if I go to D8 ADS underscore V5, it then gives me the option. It'll tell you the temp disk is 300 gig for that one. That's how we select ephemeral disks for the session hosts. As mentioned in the auto scaling configuration, you'd have to delete and recreate those VMs every day, which is quite easy to do. So let me show you how you do that. If I go into a hostbook, so go auto scale configure, this is the ephemeral disk that I've got, and you'll probably see note here as well. It's basically saying when you're using ephemeral disks, the base host pool capacity needs to be equal to the minimum active host capacity because the VMs cannot be stopped and started. Right? Imagine a scenario. I need lots of ephemeral disks, so I've got one which is running lots of VMs. Sorry, I've got one which is running 24/7. Okay. What we can do here is I can select that to 0. So I'm going to have no hosts, but then I can select a pre-staging. So I'm going to say be gone Monday to Friday at 7 a.m. I want, I don't know, 10 session hosts. Okay. And then basically what that's going to do is stop or remove any hosts that may be at 8 p.m. or sorry, only from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. It's going to gratify. So basically what that's going to do is it's going to fire up those session hosts at 7 a.m. It's going to get them ready for 7 a.m. So it'll probably create them at 6 a.m. We're going to have those powered on hosts. And then towards the end of the day, it's actually going to delete them. That's how we create our kind of non-persistent workloads using those ephemeral disks. Every day it's going to delete and recreate those hosts, and it's going to read it based off what image I select here, right? So I can go here and select maybe I want a CIS image based on that. That's how we use auto scaling alongside ephemeral disks, right? We basically need to delete and recreate the hosts every day. Okay. All right. Now we're going to go into the next stage where we're going to go log on to one of those VMs that have been created by the auto scaling. And then we're actually going to do some speed tests and see how quick these ephemeral disks are. All right. So the first test that we're doing, we've actually created a managed disk. So on this VM, it's a 128 gig premium SSD disk. Okay. So first thing, we look at the run Crystal Disk Mart as a test. We can see the write speed. So it's 158 megabits a second write speed, and we're reading around 421 megabits a second. Also, let's look at the IOPS. This tells us how IOPS we're reading and writing. So read and write 400 and 150. Memorize those numbers 400, 150, and then we can see up to 20,000 read IOPS actually, which is quite impressive. Write IOPS 2,800 and 2,614. Let's now compare that and see how it compares to ephemeral disk. That the read is 418 and 420. Similar read speeds. Write speeds 419, 420, right? So way more from a throughput speed. Okay. And again, better speeds here, but here's where it gets a bit interesting. Read IOPS, so much higher. So that was the same. But for this sequence, I'll put the numbers on the screen so you can see them side by side. And then the same for the write IOPS, like 3,208, a lot faster. And then the same. As you can see, this is the performance differences that you get between the two VMs. I've logged onto an absolute beast of a virtual machine. On this VM, we've got 256 gigs of RAM, and we've got 64 cores. But most importantly, we've got a very large disk. So we'll see what performance we're getting out of that. Just comparison-wise, scores that we got on the managed disk. We got a write speed of about 158 megabits a second. On this VM, we get a write speed of about 4,000 megabits a second. I'll put the exact numbers on the screen so you can see those as a comparison. But let's look at IOPS. On the other VM SKU, we got 150 for the first top two numbers. For this one, we got 3,913 and then 2,424, right? So more than 10 times the speed from an app perspective. For the third one down, we got 2,822 on the previous one. And this one, we got 78,141. Humongous increase in the speed that you get from that. Okay. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of the kind of speed increases that you get from using these local ephemeral disks. Let's talk about how much money would save using ephemeral disks. So ephemeral disks obviously don't cost anything because they're local storage, right? So they can be quite a good cost saver. Let's see how much it would actually cost us if we're running 50 VMs. Imagine a scenario where we've got 50 VMs, say your default ADS v5 VMs. You can see here within Nerdio, we've got the storage. This is basically telling us the minimum and maximum storage cost from SSD for 50 virtual machines. What's it going to cost me? So this is going to cost me maximum of £815 a month within the storage. Okay, so that's the cost of the managed disk. So if we now change that to ephemeral, look at the costs. Go down to zero. So for 50 VMs, that's what your saving is going to be. You're going to be saving around £800 a month. Obviously, the more VMs, like bigger the saving that's going to be. If I put up to maybe 500 VMs, that cost goes up to 7,874. If you're using a ephemeral disk with 500 VMs, my £7,874 goes down to zero. That's potential saving. The more VMs that you have, the more cost saving it's going to be. But beware of the limitations that we've already discussed. All right, so that's the end of the video. I hope you found it useful. Ephemeral disks is something which comes up quite often with customers. So You need to be aware of the limitations we've discussed around the fact that we can't stop and start them. We need to delete and recreate them. They only invert certain VM SKUs supported, and they have to be at least a kind of size. But if you want a non-persistent workload, if cost is the primary factor that's driving you, and you want to get max cost savings possible and not have to pay for those storage costs, then Ephemeral Disk is a great solution. The other requirement, if you need super fast local storage, maybe you've got an application which requires lots of IOPS, then again, that's another use case to use Ephemeral Disk for. I hope you found it useful. I hope you learned a lot more about Ephemeral Disk and how we can use them. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments window and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Goodbye.